as a postdoctoral researcher at Stanford University's Natural Language Processing Group. And also, he has been at the Johns Hopkins University's Human Language Technology Center of Excellence, Hugh Levens Language Intelligence and Information Retrieval Group in Belgium, and the University of Colorado Center for Language and Education Research. So he has been all the way along the traveling around the world and working, of course, doing a lot of interesting research as well. And of course, he works in natural language processing, machine learning theory and application, and modeling the language of time and timelines, which is not such a common subject, but very important, and normalizing text to medical and geospatial ontologies, information extraction models for clinical applications. And well, if you want more information, you can visit his site at nlp.arizona.edu. Well, okay, enough introduction. Sorry for taking too long, but well, this time is also for you so that people that accompany us can know a little more about you. Well, this is a mentoring panel. This is panel number 2. And well, we have several questions we would like to start with. Of course, if any of our attendees would like to know anything particular, please do feel free to write on the chat. Also, as you know already, you have you have over there the QA button. So please open it and write your questions. Please do interact with us. Also, maybe you can also raise your hand and ask a question directly. Well, okay, so let's begin with the questions. Let me open the document with the previous questions we have already. Give me a couple of seconds, please. Because I had it just here. Well, so before we begin, we would like to ask you to say some words about what do you think it would be the first step for having a research idea? I will give you the opportunity to talk in certain order, and this order may change. So please, Professor Leticia, can you tell us?
Okay, maybe it's a good question because it's the start of the session. I think how determine an idea? How do you select an idea? How do you choose an idea? Well, in my experience, the ideas just came up. I don't know why. Maybe because you are talking with a partner, or maybe you are talking with a professor, or maybe you read an article, a book, or maybe just reading some blog, and just you had some questions or some things you want to investigate about some topic. Then you have an idea about something to do. An important thing to do in this moment is search for information about that idea on the web, because in my experience, sometimes I have an idea, but maybe it was an idea of other previously. So maybe your idea it's not original. So maybe you have to set an idea, but first you have to look for information about that idea, because if sometimes other people was working on your idea because it's not original, maybe it doesn't work it doesn't sense to work in that sense, on that direction. So maybe you have to change or have to update your idea to another direction. Maybe it's a good starting point. Sorry, starting point is select some idea or something to do, something to investigate, something to search, something it's interesting for you to work. Maybe it's a good kickoff for the session. I don't know how to say more than that.
Well, yes, I think it's a very complex issue, and well, you have told us a very good introduction to it, because first of all, you need to know, well, if this idea you think is worth or not for pursuing this research. Then I would turn to Professor Manning into this issue. How would you say a research idea is good or not, so that you pursue it further? Would you do more experiments? Would you spend your time on it? How can you know?
I think in truth it's difficult to know. Like everyone wants to know, is this a good idea? And will it work out? But, you know, I think a lot of the time when you're going in, it's just really hard to know. And, you know, lots of things have not worked out at various times for various people. And somehow someone else does it. And because the world has changed, it becomes different. So, you know, in one sense, almost anything can be a research topic, right? That a lot of research is the state of mind and the way you approach it. So that, you know, lots of things that will just be sort of things that people could say, oh, I can, you know, write 20 lines of Python and I'll halfway do the right thing and against this problem. Well, you can turn it into a research project by simply just taking the attitude of, no, look, there are some hard cases here. We could explore different approaches, work out what cases standard methods don't handle and how we might approach them. It becomes a research project. So, you know, people have written research papers about the sort of smallest, very specific little things, like, you know, how to decide if a period, a full stop is the end of the sentence or not, right? That can be a research project. So beyond that, it's, yeah, trying to decide what's a good one or what's a bad one. And I think I think there are things to try and get right there. So, like, you don't want to aim way too high, right? If your research project is that dependent on, okay, I want to do some really subtle pragmatics of translation so that you can capture high level cultural factors in translation. Well, probably you're not actually going to be able to achieve that. So that's a bad research project. I mean, you also can't aim too low, and this is partly being aware of what's done before, because if what you're doing isn't really interesting relative to what people have done before, that's not. So you sort of have to be at about the right level where it's just beyond, usually just beyond, not very far beyond what people have done previously. And then, you know, something has to intrigue you, and you have to see in that being intrigued by something, a place that you can contribute something different. And, you know, what intrigues you could be, you know, a different source of data or an emerging thing on the web that's then sort of a topic of some different form of communication people haven't really been dealing with previously. Or it could be a much more theoretical thing that you've got an idea of how to change a transformer model and you think it might be better, but, you know, something has to intrigue you. And, you know, being intrigued by something is, I think, the first big ingredient of, oh, choose something for which that's true. But, you know, if lots of things intrigue you, I think then, you know, two important attributes are, one, you know, it's good if you're picking something that you have some advantages in. So whether, you know, this can be because you have the data available or because you've spent a lot of time studying optimization recently or whatever it is. If it's something where you've got some angle of advantage that most other people don't have, that's a good reason it's a good topic for you. I guess Herb Simon used to refer to that phrase decades ago as, you want to have a secret weapon, as something that gives you an advantage in this area. And then the other one is, it's good that it's a topic that some other people care about as well. And I mean, obviously this varies. Some things appeal to a small specialized community and some appeal to a lot of people. But, you know, if you can talk about 3 ideas with your colleagues and one of them excites the other people more, all else being equal, that's probably a good one to be choosing.
Okay, that's a very good answer. I would like to summarize quickly that first you need to see the state of the art, to read what is the current state of the things. There must be something that intrigues you. So curiosity is very important. You should see also your advantages, your own advantages in order to pursue something. And finally, talk to your colleagues, right? Well, those are some key points which I find very, very good to pursue. And Professor Stephen, could you tell us, in your experience, what are also these key points that, as you have experienced in your career, how has been this translation from an idea into an experiment? How did you choose your first experiment?
So I built a little bit off of what Chris mentioned, the 20 lines of Python code. I think you really want to start off with, whatever, 20 lines of Python code that is a total hack, but is just enough to convince yourself that the idea is worth pursuing. So, don't start by implementing your whole cool, complex idea. Do something really, I would say stupid. One of my colleagues has a nicer phrase, cheap and cheerful. That's just a quick hack to see, like, I have this idea. Can I convince myself it's plausible? So maybe it's something as simple as just sort of counting some instances of something that's relevant to your idea, or maybe it's trying to solve, some chunk of stuff that's not solved by previous models. Often it means like taking an existing model, hacking it just a tiny bit to see if that makes it better on whatever your idea is. Right? And so this is part of the question of, how do you decide whether the idea is good or not? And as Chris has said, you don't know off the bat. There's some things you can look at, but it can be really, really hard. And the only way you're really going to answer that is by doing a bit of the research. But at the same time, you don't want to decide, okay, it's going to take me 3 months to implement the model I want to implement, and I still have no idea whether it's going to work. So that first little, couple different hacks. Another aspect of this same kind of thing might be, as Chris kind of suggested in the same context, staring at the data a bit. So, take an existing model, run it on the data, and look at what's wrong. Look at what it doesn't get. See if you can characterize those, and again, see if you can think of a cheap hack that fixes some of those. Once you've got some feel for what the problems are and what the data look like, well, then maybe you can formulate an interesting idea, your full model that you then spend a much longer time on. So I think that would be everyone else has kind of covered most of what I would say, but I think the idea of making sure you can do something cheap and cheerful quick before you dive all the way into a really interesting but deep topic is really important.
Yeah, that's nice. So you suggest hands-on the problem, standing on the shoulder of a giant or what others have done previously. And then as you are working, getting your hands dirty, then you will find interesting things, right? Thank you, Stephen. And there is some participant is Ilaria. She wants to say something. So please, Ilaria. I don't know if you are.
Let me. I can.
Okay. Yes, I got it. Okay.
Thank you.
Yes. Hi. I would like to build on. I was the person to ask the question regarding how can we use the models of of NLP to help analyze endangered languages. I'm a speaker of an indigenous language from Mexico called Chatino. I'm a linguist, and as you know, this knowledge, the programming knowledges and knowledges about all of these systems, belong to the people who still, who have, power, people, indigenous people have not had the privileges to be able to study, to study these models and access to this knowledge. So some disadvantages that we have right now is that, like, for example, I myself would like to do some experiments but I don't know how to program, so this means that I might have to, collaborate with somebody else who does it. And my experience is, this is changing a little bit now, that, computational linguists were not interested in working on endangered languages. And as I said, that is changing a little bit. But, so given that, I have this idea, like, for example, I have this very specific idea of an experiment that I would like to do. And this will be, to help expand the corpus of the Chatino language. There is an area in the Chatino language that is that I find really beautiful and very rich as well. And it is the area of existentials, existential verbs, which is like existentials, including, positionals, like, for example, standing, sitting, laying. And the Chatino language, exploits existentials to, to build metaphors, to do poetics. And like, one of the things that I would like to do will be, like, for example, like right now, I can just give you an example. Like, to stand means don, and then you add you add a particle which means a soul of a person. So if I say dori, like, that means standing plus this particle existential, this emotional particle means to be happy. Squatty, to lay, plus this particle re means to be fed up of someone. So little things like that. So one of the things that I would like to do will be, like, to pair up, like one of, any expressions of any category of the language, and then bring together, from left to right, just kind of build two parts together, like see what kind of expressions and what kind of metaphors you can come up with that. So, is this like a good idea to pursue, to collaborate with someone, or this is something that is not feasible? I'm sure that it is, but, how and who will I, seek to collaborate with?
I can try and answer that one a little. Yeah, so, I mean, I think you are right. It can be difficult. I would honestly suggest that one part of things that you probably should consider is learn to program somewhat, learn to be able to write scripts in Python. That's not an impossibly high standard. Lots and lots of people who are linguists or people working in history or other humanities and social sciences have learned to program, at least to the extent that they can write themselves 50 lines of Python, Jupyter notebooks kind of thing, so they can do some of their own data processing. I mean, I do think that that's actually just gives you a very powerful new ability, because it gives you an ability to do quite a lot of starting things yourself rather than being very dependent on someone else. So I really do believe that and would advise that. But clearly the other way to do things is to find collaborations and work with people. And I think for that, what you said is right, that sort of traditionally the NLP community, in short, wasn't very interested in low resource and indigenous languages. There clearly is change there, that there's starting to be a lot more interest. And so the chances of connecting with people and doing stuff together, I think, are much higher. I mean, for the specific project that you mentioned, well, it's great that you have something specific and clear in mind, and that could be a good project. I mean, I suspect at the start that there'll be sort of needing to get on somewhere near the same page. And if it's some NLP person of let's start looking at this language, that's sort of looking at the existential verb seems a long way up, and that they're probably going to first say, but wait a minute, do we have a collection of texts of this language, and can we work out what the different parts of speech of words are? And gee, then we need to know something about the word structure to find these endings. And you know all of that stuff, but if it's sort of an NLP person approaching it from the outside and wanting to do computational development, I think that they're likely to say, oh, well, there's actually quite a lot of prior resource development that we need to do before we could actually approach that question. So perhaps some patience would be needed.
Can I just briefly follow on to Chris's comment? I think I agree with him 100%. If I were trying to sell a project like that, I would try to convince, I would look for people who are interested in what's often called few shot learning, because I think you're likely to have very small numbers of examples. And as I think Chris mentioned in his talk, right, there's probably some hope, even if you don't have enough data from your language, that maybe if you could pick other related families. And I think you'd just be more likely to sell an NLP collaborator on, hey, well, you know, let's look at these language families, but with a goal of solving this particular problem in the language that I care about. And then there's probably enough data that the NLP person doesn't get sort of too afraid, like, I don't know how I'm going to do this with only 10 examples, which is probably one of the first things that you might worry that I would say. I mean, I think there's something there. And if you also sort of broadened it to something like, I'm really just interested in concatenations of words and what the meaning that comes out of it. I think there's a lot of, you know, interest in how these like contextual language models combine words together. So there might be something that's sort of a step broader than exactly what you're thinking about, but that could solve your problem as sort of a sub piece. So I think that, again, kind of like what Chris said, there's some negotiation there about like, how do you convince a person with the you know, more technical skills that you need that this problem is doable with the tools that they're used to using? And I think that would definitely take a deep discussion.
Definitely. Well, there is a lot to say in this direction. And following with we have a lot of questions here with our attendees, and also they want to know about if would you recommend taking courses, Python courses, or which kind of elements would you need in order to have a good approach to these kind of problems? So maybe
I can recommend. In my experience, it was a good idea to take some brief courses about Python, because as I say in my session yesterday, there are a lot of information about Python related to NLP. So it's a good advice from my point of view, of course, is take some courses about Python, because it's a very simple and very practical language, programming language. And there are a lot of information on the web with notebooks or with in GitHub or maybe in many places. And also some books are, the practice in some books are writing in Python. So that is my advice for him.
Thank you, Professor. And also, once you have some experiments, once you have some idea, what would be your recommendation for taking this to publishing into, well, the question particular is for publishing in top NLP journals or venues?
Yeah, so once you're starting to develop your idea, you'll start to see things and hopefully discover things that you think are interesting, and you learn a lot. I mean, for having something that's then successful as a paper, I mean, you really have to take an external perspective. So you've been working on something and you think it's, cool what you've built, and you've learned a lot about some phenomena or some model, and that's great for you. But if you're going to be writing a paper, you have to take the perspective of someone else over here, and it's okay for someone reading this who is aware of what other work has come out recently. What do I have that's different that'll be interesting? And so that you can then focus the paper of what you write as something interesting that has some different perspective, or novel data, or a different model that works well, that will be interesting to another party. And then, for sort of particularly writing things up. So in NLP, I mean, the majority of work that's done comes out in conferences. So there are various conferences that include ACL and ENLP. There's other ones like NACL and Coling and so on. So for most people, trying to get a paper into a conference is the first port of call. And I realize that there are various difficulties that with respect to that, with respect to Central and South America. One is been the cost of getting to conferences, though I guess at least right at the moment, with everything being online, has sort of solved some of that. And the other one has been the question of how things are valued, that some systems really value journal publications and don't really count conferences the same. And well, to the extent that that's true, you should certainly be considering things. So the ACL has TACL that counts as a journal, but as relatively short papers. And so that might be a good target. But I think one way and TACL papers can then be presented at conferences as well. I think one way or another, it's just really valuable if you can to connect with conference communities, because I think, as well as starting to build connections with other people, it just gives you a very tangible sense of what the community is like, what they're doing and what they're interested in. And it's just very hard to get that if you're trying to, work in them just in the context of your university or wherever you are, trying to write a journal paper by yourself.
Right, and there is where I think this is very important to have this kind of events. Stephen, sorry, please.
I was just going to add that, kind of stepping back to the how do you take your idea and turn it into a publication. I think, and Chris kind of alluded to this, but I think you really need to have an explicit hypothesis that you're testing, right? And so if this is that the innovation that I came up with is better than whatever the state of the art is, then you need to be explicit about that. So in some ways, this may be about baselines, right? You better be comparing whatever your idea was to some other baseline, but it's usually more than that, right? So let's say you show that you've outperformed this baseline. Every reviewer is going to ask you, why? Why did it work? And if you added, 30 different things to a previously existing architecture, every reviewer is going to say, but which of those 30 things mattered? So there has to be some real analysis there that says, look, not only did I solve this problem that I'm interested in better than previous approaches have done it, but I can tell you a bit why that happened. So in addition to just sort of engineering your solution, you need to make sure you're able to answer the question of why did it work? And that's kind of the difference between a paper that gets in and a paper that doesn't, right? Even a good paper that, gets a new state of the art, if you can't explain anything, it's going to have a hard time, and it's basically doing engineering rather than science, right? And it's easier to publish a science paper than an engineering one.
Right, and I think you indirectly answered the question that asks Dalia, how to do a good experimental setup. I think it's very connected with this. I don't know if you want to add something else in this regard.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. That's very closely related. So clearly, you need to have in your mind, like, what are the things you're comparing, right? So, and you need to have some explanation of what is making something better than the other. I think when you're thinking about experimental setup, you need to be thinking about other things as well, though. So let's say you've got this great idea, you need to figure out what data you can demonstrate this idea on. And maybe there's an existing data set and you use it directly, but maybe there's no existing data set for your great idea. If there isn't an existing data set, then you need to find data, either by finding, say, a related task that you can somehow repurpose the data, maybe by reformatting or changing the question a little bit, or you need to construct data on your own. And of course, that could be an entirely different question. How do you construct data in a reliable way? So I think that has to be a really important decision. As soon as you have a rough idea of the thing you want to try, the thing you want to compare and test, what can you actually test it on? Right. And then at that point, you have an idea and the data. You can get back to my earlier point of trying something really dumb to convince yourself you can do something on the data, and then go into actually designing this sort of real experiment. But you have all the pieces at that point.
Right. Thank you. Professor Torletti. Yes.
Just for add some information about Stephen said. From a student point of view, maybe it's a good practice to organize the information and organize the execution, because sometimes you want to design some experiments, but you don't take care about what model has to do or what you want to obtain with the execution of each model. So it's a good practice to put all the information in somewhere, a table or whatever you want, and put the name of the model, put of the hyperparameters, and also add information about the goal of that experiment, because it's a good way to maintain a good organization of your execution or the experiment you want to do. So just an advice about organization. What else?
Yeah, right. So almost you read my mind, because I was just about to ask you to turn the question of Joseph Marvin. How many months do you usually allot for constructing papers and doing needed experiments? How do you balance this?
Maybe it's difficult because it depends on the problem you are working, and of course it depends about the destination of your publication. In my experience, when we are working about or in a paper for a conference or for a competition, we just need the result. After we have the result, maybe 1 or 2 months, it's enough for a conference. But if you want to publish in an article in a better journal, of course, it takes, from my point of view, at least 6 months, because you need to write well all the ideas, all the key questions, and describe perfectly the result, and of course, write down all the conclusion, and of course, your work has to be important, interesting. So it takes some months, at least 6 or maybe 8 months from my point of view, of course.
I mean, I think there are things that I think there are things that take even longer than that. Yeah, so there clearly isn't one answer. I mean, there are some cases where, I mean, there's some very clear idea that you could do this experiment, which adds, you know, some change to something like perhaps a neural model. And it's just, okay, here's this idea. I think this will help. I can go off and run some experiments, and at least if it works out, I can write it up, and you can sort of do this whole paper in 3 months. I mean, that clearly happens. You know, it's much easier for that to happen if you're already further along in having done research work, because, you know, if this is an idea that's sort of a change to something that is a topic that you've already worked on and published papers in and have code lying around that does the standard thing, well, then you're maybe in a position where you can sort of quickly change things, run some experiments, write it up, 3-month project. But, you know, at the other extreme, there are clearly projects that take years. So that, I mean, one project I remember with the student Spence Green is, you know, the idea was that we wanted to try and build a new, much more human-centered generation of help for a translator. So wanting to give translators the kind of power you got from modern machine translation, but rather than it just being go off to Google Translate and paste your sentence in and see what comes back. What we wanted to do was to construct something that looked just like an editor, but gave suggestions as you went along and were translating it. I mean, in the monolingual sense, Google is now sort of themselves rolled out stuff like this. So now that if you write in a Google Doc, it starts suggesting following words. So we were wanting around, and you know, this is about 5 or so years ago, to provide something like that in a bilingual context for a translator. And then we also wanted to learn from what the translator was doing so we could then customize to what they wanted to do. And, you know, effectively, this was a huge project because it needed a ton of engineering on the back end to be getting a machine translation system that ran fast enough interactively that we had a chance of using it. It then needed a ton of work on the front end of, you know, using JavaScript frameworks and a web browser so that you could do things of providing suggestions as you went. And then we had to prove that this would actually be useful to people. So that meant we had to be doing human subject studies of getting translators and getting them to use this versus conventional systems and show that they could get value out of it. And I mean, when you put all those pieces together, then that's a 2-year project to put together a paper. So there's sort of this big spectrum along those lines.
Yeah, and precisely along this line of doing some research of what has been published, Christian Caballero asks how to cope with the amount of research getting published now. For example, last year's ACL main conference alone had 779 papers. It's overwhelming. Transformers are not even captured in any published book.
Yeah, that sounds like a really hard problem. Someone should solve that with NLP or something. I mean, the reality is it's impossible to read all these papers. I mean, you obviously already know that. So you have to be selective. And honestly, the other thing that I rely on heavily is collaborators, because there's no way that I can read all of these things. So I rely on, you know, I will do sort of targeted searches for the things that I'm specifically working on. I work a lot on timelines. I work a lot on medical stuff. So I'll maybe do targeted searches for those things, but I'm going to miss all kinds of stuff. So I have, you know, a lab full of grad students who all go and read different stuff. And so I rely on them. I have colleagues at other universities where we share Slack channels. I'm not very active on Twitter, but I know a lot of other people get these from Twitter. There's no like one single answer. You basically need to have your tentacles out in every possible way, and you're still going to miss great papers that are probably relevant to you. And hopefully maybe you'll catch them next year, because next year's paper that you do find will cite one of them. But yeah, it's really hard. It's really, really hard to stay on top of all these things. And I think one of the biggest things that I probably miss in my own strategies is there's very likely work that's outside my little narrow focus that would absolutely be relevant, that I could, you know, take the techniques they're applying to some other thing, say machine translation, and apply them to time normalization. But because I don't have the bandwidth to read every machine translation paper to figure out which ones there are, I don't see those. So yeah, it's really hard, and you have to use a lot of different tools. I don't know if maybe the other folks here have better solutions than I do, but.
Yeah, and in the same line, Jason Angel asks, well, he says also that this is overwhelming. And what do you think is a good habit to balance learning versus actually working on projects? What would be your advice?
Oh, I have advice on that. Work on a project. Yeah, I mean, so obviously you need to learn some things, of course you do. And so, yeah, it's good to do some classes, read some books and papers, of course you do. But, you know, that can never come to an end, right? That there's just massively more stuff coming out that you don't know about than you could possibly ever get on top of. And a lot of the time, your working, thinking, and learning is just sort of unfocused and not as effective if you're just sort of doing it on the basis of, oh, there's all this stuff I don't know, I need to know about all of it. That I think it's just way more productive and allows you to engage in much more focused learning if you pick a particular project and then you're reading on the basis of, well, other people have approached this problem using a variational autoencoder. Okay, well, I guess I'd better learn what a variational autoencoder is so I can understand these other papers and think whether they might be helpful.
Yeah, I see. And Iman Jundi asks if, in your experience, would you recommend some general best practices to follow or to avoid pitfalls that would you point for young researchers, or some advice on this? Maybe Professor Leti, would you like to give us some clue? What is one thing maybe you have seen young students repeatedly do wrong? Or
I don't know if I understood the question, but I think he's asking for how to proceed in research.
How to avoid pitfalls, common pitfalls that we tend to go after.
I recommend to my students always read a lot. When you have some problem with a model, or maybe sometimes the problem is the data is we don't have the data to test the model, or maybe some other problem, I recommend to investigate and research and read and try to look for some solution to something similar, and trying to, of course, get out of that problem. I don't know if the question is that. I don't know if my opinion is important, but I don't know how can I recommend another thing. I don't know how to say about that. Maybe just try to read and research about the topic or the problem, and try to start to work in another direction, maybe.
I'll say one pitfall that I see students do all the time, which is fail to compare against a really dumb baseline. So it's just, it's too often someone will get excited about an idea and they'll go implement their complicated model, but they didn't do the sort of dumber, simpler version of that model first. And it turns out the dumber, simpler version of that model actually works almost as well. Which may be by itself a finding, depending on sort of what the state of the art is and what exactly your problem is. But, in terms of understanding where your contribution is, you really, really need to think hard about what you're comparing against. So what's the simplest version of what you're proposing, and are you really beating that? So think the simple thing first, even if it's not your main idea, because you need to set a baseline that people will believe.
Yeah, good recommendations. And about when you are doing some experiments and then it gets problems of scaling, maybe it gets so complex. So Juan Flores asks, if you have problems with the complexity of a certain task, what advice would you give in order to scale a problem, having in mind a given goal? Do you have a special way of doing it? Like key questions or asking oneself or things like that, he says.
Oh.
Maybe Professor Chris has a good answer for this.
I'm not sure, but I can try and say something. So
it's a difficult question.
I mean, is this complexity of the problem because there's many parts, or just because it's big and has a lot of runtime? So I'll try and give an answer. Yeah. So I mean, in the first instance, it's great if you can validate ideas in the small, and so hopefully in the first case you can get a sense of whether things are interesting and have possibilities by looking at small things. And even to this day, to the extent that there are sort of good ideas that have come out in deep learning, or good ideas that come out in other places, they have normally first shown their value in very small things. And if you can sort of show value in small things, that gives you a lot of nimbleness, because you can move quickly, and the more quickly you can decide whether this idea does seem to have some promise or not, the better. But there are lots of times where you can't stop there, because it genuinely is the case that it'll only really be interesting if you can do it at a fairly large scale, given the big models that people build in NLP these days. Or there's an extensive project like the example I gave before of the translators editor, and it's then sort of only becomes real if you make it large. And I think that's genuinely hard, and there isn't an easy answer to it. That I think the in modern NLP, you just do have to have yourself or collaborators with a fair degree of skill in engineering larger systems. But some parts of it have been getting easier. So for areas like deep learning, with the kind of great software frameworks that are out there, like PyTorch and TensorFlow, and particular packages like Hugging Face transformers. On the other hand, the good side is that using some of these libraries, you can do in a week experiments that would have taken months when people were building stuff by hand themselves, which isn't actually that long ago, right? Around a decade ago in 2011, we were completely hand programming neural networks from scratch in code.
Yeah, right. Well, it's a complex situation you may face. In this regard, also, we have the question of what would happen. Joseph Marvin says, sometimes you can foreshow for an idea implemented and it may fail in the middle of your timeline. Then do you continue, or do you try to revise your idea and start again from scratch? What would you do?
I really like this question, because I think as a researcher, you really need to be thinking about some ideas fail. It's absolutely the case. We talked about this right from the beginning, that you don't know at the beginning whether your idea is going to succeed or fail. And you absolutely need to have the ability to sometimes give up and say, I tried this in several different, very reasonable ways, and none of those reasonable ways end up with the outcome I expected. Maybe I should work on a different idea. Can I tell you exactly when you've hit that point? Probably not. But I guess, when I'm advising my own grad students, if, they've been sort of up against a wall for about 6 months and we've tried a whole bunch of different things, that's usually a time to say, either this is not the right problem to work on, or we're not formulating it right, but we need to set it aside for now and maybe come back to it in 6 months or a year. And sometimes it's much less than 6 months, and sometimes it's much more than 6 months. But I definitely start thinking, like, if you feel like you've tried 3 or 4 or 5 different ways of doing something and they're not working, that would probably be time to shift gears in my mind.
I see. Well, everything is very useful. Yeah. Would you like to say something, Professor Letty?
No, just I agree with Steven, with the idea of Steven.
Thank you. And well, I think also in order for this to work well, you need a good advisor. And also we have the question of how to contact a potential PhD advisor or a potential host for a postdoc, for example. How to choose?
Yeah, I say, I mean, so you have to be aware of different university systems. So, I mean, in USA universities, that basically that faculty aren't admitting their own students, that departments are admitting students. And so you can get in touch with people to try and find out more about their interests, etc. But effectively, there's a department-wide grad school admissions process, and you're applying to that and wanting to show that you're a strong student. I mean, that's not true in a whole bunch of other countries, including Australia, where I was born, where it is very much that individual faculty deciding to take an individual person as their student, and then you much more have to be working with the student. But, you know, even though you're going through a department, you obviously want to be having a department with good people. And so you want to be doing some research. You want to be seeing what kind of topics people work on. If possible, it's good to be at a place with more than one faculty member in your area of interest. Commonly, a great way of getting information is to talk to, well, that often means emailing or whatever, of their grad students, because that's often the most useful way to get information about what different places are like and whether you think you might have a good home there. For further on, for the postdoc level, postdocs, there are a few kind of postdoc competitions, but the vast majority of those are individual contact between different people. And you know, different things happen, but often the best chance of a postdoc is that there's some pre-existing, I'll call it relationship, but, you know, you've at least heard of each other because you've exchanged some emails or talked at a conference or something like that. So I guess a general topic here is networking, that I think, you know, it's just really useful in any ways that you can start to get connected into the academic community. And there are lots of ways in terms of going to online talks, interacting with people on email, that you can sort of start to build connections once you have an academic area of interest where you can start to get to know some other people that are doing similar things.
Yeah, and indeed, in this sense, Beatriz Hernandez asks how to identify potential collaborators. For example, not only for pursuing a PhD or postdoc, but for publishing an idea. How do you reach them?
In my experience, I identify people when I teach undergraduate students. I identify some interesting student because he wants to research and he wants to read and he wants to work. And then if they have some idea to do to make a postdoc, a postgrad or something like that, of course, I remember that was a good student and I see some kind of potential. So for me, it's a recipe that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, that like if you're in the same university, simply reaching out to faculty members who have shared interests can be very effective. I mean, in my university, at least, it's very common for undergrads and master's students to reach out and say, I'm interested in your field, can I sit in your lab meeting? And eventually most of those students end up coming up with a project together. I think the harder question is the outside of your university one. How do you find collaborators outside? And I honestly don't know what I would have recommended before kind of everything went online, because it's not practical to go to every conference when you have to fly there and pay for all of that stuff. But I really do think, like, if you want to get an idea who you could really interact with, is chatting with them in front of their poster is probably one of the most effective ways to see whether you actually have aligning interests. And so, maybe in the virtual world, that's a bit more possible than it was before, although whether the connection is as tight, I don't know. I will say, sort of cold emailing almost never works. Like if you say, dear professor, I'm really interested in such and such paper that you wrote. Most of those are responded to something like, thanks for your interest. Here's the student you can contact if you want to ask more questions about this paper, which is probably not what you were going for. So I mean, I wish I had the time to be, sort of coming up with new collaborations over email, but it doesn't really happen. So I think conferences are a huge networking opportunity.
In a way, I mean, what Stephen just said is right, but in another way, I sort of a little bit disagree with that, since I think you absolutely shouldn't be put off making connections and getting things started over email or over any other kind of sort of chat service, whether it's sort of bulletin boards, Slack, whatever works for different groups of people. And I mean, I think the main advice is to sort of go for the right level, because yeah, it's probably not the case that you can just sort of send a cold email and say, dear Yoshua Bengio, I'd like to chat with you about this, and have it work. That's true. But, actually, if you're a student, getting started with grad students is a really good place, right? That if there's someone has written a couple of papers on a topic you're interested in and you've read them carefully, you don't want to just have something generic of, I read your paper, I really enjoyed it, can we start working together? That's not going to work. But if you've read it carefully and you have something meaningful to say of, I don't understand why you put this into the model, I would have thought it would work as well or better if you changed it and put in this sort of layer instead. Did you consider doing something like that? I think the majority of times you will get answers, and there are lots of people that frankly wish more people were interested in paying attention to their work, and so I think there are good opportunities to get things started and then start working together. And a lot of people are actually getting collaboration started is sort of hard, actually. In my experience, what happens all the time is I have people telling me that they wish they had someone to collaborate with on this project, but they haven't, they're not succeeding in finding them. So if you can sort of help create those connections, that can really work. Another thing that's a little different that I think has been very effective for many people recently is that there are sort of these bigger collaborative frameworks, so if you like more systemsy stuff, you could sort of plow into the PyTorch community or something like that and sort of get involved, but at a more NLP level. So to return to Hugging Face, so Hugging Face is this startup that does the Transformers package. They've been involved in doing more community-oriented things. They're doing some things right at the moment around large language models. They've done other exercises and trying to collect the common data sets repository. And so it's sort of fairly easy to start getting involved in those communities. And I know a number of students have sort of started places like that and found projects to work with on people, and that then immediately gives them collaborators and community.
And also in that sense, maybe we are shy the first time we want to do the defense of our first idea. Daniel Huerta asks, what would your recommendations to be prepared when someone is about to do his or her first idea's defense?
Don't feel bad when people are critical. I mean, critical is actually a good thing. You should think about it as they're basically giving you new further research ideas. So, I mean, you're going to get an idea, you're going to present it. It's probably even going to be a good idea, or you wouldn't be presenting it, but people will have additions and subtractions and they'll pick it apart. And, don't take it as a negative thing, take it as a positive thing. They're giving you extra ideas on how to pursue it. So, and that's not true. That's true, not just for the first idea, but for every idea, right?
I see. I think that's a good advice. And in general, also we have questions that are concerned with the length of their for example, for a PhD, how long would it take you to have a first initial contribution, or how long after you do a postdoc you will be able to do some publication? What is your experience in that sense?
And my experience, or my student experience, if a PhD student has been working in some topics related to the PhD, for instance, for the undergraduate thesis, maybe I think 1 year, because he's or she's working before sometime before start the PhD. I think that 1 year maybe it's a good time. But if your PhD studies are new, is a new student for the topics related to his or her PhD, maybe more time, I think 2 years, 3 years, I don't know, in order to obtain good results to publish, I think.
Thank you, Professor Leticia. And also we have a question from YouTube. We have also a lot of YouTubers, of people in YouTube watching us. And he says, or she, it's Kokoro Oficial. I don't know the real name. And she or he wants to do a chatbot for Twitter in order to pursue hashtags in Spanish. But he or she says, there is a lot of information about that. What or where would you suggest to begin with?
I mean, yeah, I guess what's the first question here is, you know, what's the research project? Because I mean, it's one thing to think, oh, it'd be really great to have some kind of chat bot on Twitter that you can interact with various things, and that'd be useful. And, you know, absolutely. And that could be, you know, a fun project of learn about building things and doing things. But, you know, that by itself hasn't given you a research project, because you don't really have a question as to what you want to investigate and how, and what's new or different to some other things. So, I mean, there's lots of work that has worked on chatbots, and there's lots of work that's, you know, done things with Twitter, but somehow you need to be coming up with sort of some hypotheses so that you've got something interesting to test. This isn't exactly what you were talking about, but to say one example, since it's something I've been working with in students with our chatbot, I mean, so something that we were testing recently was, so in theories of communication, there's this idea that if you're asking a lot of questions, that actually sort of decreases the initiative of the other party, because they're just sort of responding to your questions. And so really, if you want to engage the initiative of the other party, you could be better off not asking questions, so that rather than saying, what did you have for lunch today, you're better off having your chatbot saying, oh, I had a really lovely avocado toast for lunch today, and that would then hopefully sort of get them speaking more effectively about their experiences. Well, that's then a clear piece of research. There's a hypothesis, there's an experiment you can run by manipulating how the chatbot behaves, and then that can be a research paper.
I can add, if I can, in my project, just last year, we started to study chatbot, and 2 books that it helped us very much are Applied Text Analysis from Benford and Speech and Processing from Jurassic. the books are 2 chapters dedicated to chatbot. So maybe it's a good kickoff to start to study chatbot.
Thank you very much. And regarding these kind of issues, what kind of libraries do you like? I don't know if they mean libraries for going to read a good book, or Emmanuel Rosillo asks if it's a library for programming. So, well, maybe you can choose both
Maybe
of the meaning.
The libraries, because he was asking for Python. I think it's the same.
Okay, maybe.
I don't know.
I think it's more modern, this latter meaning.
Isn't there only one library now? All NLP is done on Hugging Face. Isn't that basically the answer to every question now?
Well, yeah. Well, there you have, Emmanuel. And what about some research that is out of mainstream? Jason Angel says sometimes this kind of research out of mainstream is more difficult to sell. For example, NLP task from Spanish, because there is no English data set to compare with. So how would you argue in favor of such research in order to get them published?
Yeah. So yes, that is true, right? So there's clearly unfortunate biases and power structures and academic communities as well. And, you know, the truth is that it is just harder to get work recognized if you do work in any other language than English. I mean, you know, it's sad to say that. That's the honest reality of how the world is at the moment. I mean, so, I mean, in ways to at least sort of think about that. So, I mean, I think one thing to do is to think about your audience. So you want to have, you know, some people interested in what you're doing, and you want to have some sense of who those people are and where they are in terms of, you know, what conferences they go to or what journals that they publish in. And I mean, you know, some things are just sort of the center of the universe and everyone in NLP is interested in them. But, you know, there are lots of other topics. So I think Stephen mentioned earlier, sort of temporal processing, right? So there's been a community of people that have been interested in the temporal aspects of language and doing projects, you know, from the simplest kind of time expression recognition to more complex sort of temporal relationships between clauses or through discourses. Or, you know, that's not the sort of big center of NLP, but there's a community of people interested in that. And so providing you can kind of connect together with them, that you can still do perfectly well, get your papers in, get people who are interested in it and want to do it. And, you know, the same is true for particular languages, that there are communities of people who are interested in different languages. I mean, two other ideas. You know, one thing that has been quite successful, I think, for work in different languages is kind of getting together in bigger frameworks that involve lots of different languages. So a project that I've spent a lot of time on is the Universal Dependencies Framework, which is a syntactic dependencies framework with parallel structure across a lot of languages. But, you know, I think that's provided an opening for a lot of people working in different languages because, well, there's a reason to be interested in modern Irish, or there's a reason to be interested in Swahili in the context of this whole community of universal dependencies. And, you know, other areas, you know, have similarly had groups of things, whether it's in machine translation, sets of languages, or other areas. So I think that's a good one. Sometimes, you know, if you think you have something that's a good general idea and you'd like to have it showing that it has distinctive value in, say, Spanish. I mean, I think there's an honest truth that sometimes it's just useful if you can to also demonstrate it in English, even though it's perhaps not as good an example because it doesn't happen as widely. I mean, the same thing even happens with sort of things like data sets, right? That if you've got some wonderful data set of, corporate communications, but you can't actually just publish them all for the world, and you want to show interesting results from that, there are lots of times that just be useful to also show what you could do with a public data set, because it's just a way of sort of connecting to more people and showing the breadth of your ideas.
I'd follow up on that last point by saying that, if for some reason you really can't show the same thing on English, one of the things that I see most often dinged on papers that are using a technique for a language that hasn't been used before is that they may not take the most state-of-the-art technique from English, and then they get sort of dinged on that. I think in some ways that problem has gotten less of an issue because it's easier to get a BERT now. You can even get a Spanish BERT, or you can get a multilingual BERT. And so I think in some ways you can head off some of those concerns by saying, hey, look, we know that for this related English problem that isn't identical to our problem, what works really well is such and such Roberta model or whatever. So we'll take the closest equivalent we have to that, multilingual BERT or Spanish BERT, which I think is called Beto or whatever, and we'll apply that in the same way. And then we'll do our own innovation on top of that. So even though you're not actually evaluating in English, you are drawing your baseline from the English baseline. And I think that's not going to solve the problems for everyone, but it will solve the problems for a few more reviewers who are a little, a little bit more persuaded because they believe at least your baseline, even if they can't see how it would work in English.
And precisely related to this, what you have just said, we have a question that says, do we always have to evaluate or compare against deep neural network-based techniques? It has become very frequent when submitting a paper to have comments from the reviewers, such as, you should try using a deep neural network method to compare. Why did you not try with BERT? How to answer or argue with these comments, especially if the focus of the paper is not on proposing a novel neural network-based method. Seems like many reviewers are biased towards deep NN.
I have to share my favorite review that we got, I think, a year ago, which was, why are you still comparing to BERT? It's so out of date. And I was a little frustrated because one, the BERT paper hadn't come out yet. And yeah, okay, fine, we'll switch to Roberta, but come on. So you're never going to get away from reviewers that are demanding that you compare with a thing that was created a month ago. I honestly, and I would love to tell you that you could get away without comparing to neural networks, but unless you have a problem where you can literally demonstrate they don't work, you're not going to get away from it. I mean, basically the baseline these days is throw Roberta at it and see if it works. And the upside is that Hugging Face library makes it fairly easy to do that. Will you do it as well as if you take a course on deep neural networks and knew how to tune everything? No, probably not. But I don't think you're gonna, in any time nearby, be able to say, our baseline is a bag of words support vector machine. No one's gonna accept that anymore. So yes, you kind of do have to compare against a neural network. Sorry, I apologize for the community.
Well, there is always this reviewer number 2. You see, there is even a Twitter account that mocks all these comments that sometimes we receive that say, oh, maybe it's too much, but well, we have to cope with that, as you say. And regarding the publishing of negative results, what do you recommend? Do you think it's better to improve a very competitive benchmark, which is very common in NLP, or is it possible sometimes to propose a way of solving a task that is completely different, I don't know, of now with the explainable AI, for example, that says, well, my method is 2 points below the top score, but with my method, you can explain this and this and this. What do you think about this kind of papers?
I think they're great, and you should absolutely do that. Yeah, so there's no doubt that there's this sort of recipe which in some sense has become the kind of standard recipe these days of what you do is take some tasks that other people have worked on, work out how to make the bottom line number go up a bit so that you can claim that you have the better system and try and publish that. But a lot of times those papers aren't very interesting. And so there are a lot of other things that you can do. You can be working on different algorithms or approaches. You can be looking at analysis of performance, or you could be wanting to have systems that are much more explainable, or you can have negative results of things not working. Now, you know, at this point, I have to confess that, you know, things aren't trivial. You know, all else being equal, it's harder to publish a negative result than a positive result. That's sort of the truth. But on the other hand, I think there's actually huge hunger for these different kinds of papers that, you know, a lot of the papers that I've just sort of built this system with more tweaks and the numbers went up 1% are very boring when it comes down to it. So there is a lot of interest in doing something else. You have to just make sure you're doing it thoroughly and in an interesting way. So you have to have some clear, interesting results. Well, if the gain is that it's more understandable for an explainable AI, well, you have to sort of actually demonstrate that that's true. Or if it's a negative result that something doesn't work, well, you actually have to be really careful and try it 5 different ways and have some explanation for why something that you think would work doesn't work. So it's actually convincing to people. But I mean, I think you can absolutely do that. And often those kinds of papers are actually much more interesting.
If you want to see a great example of that kind of thing, go check the axes on Chris's talk earlier today, right? I think a lot of this is about picking the right axes. If the axis you want to show is that, you know, we're more efficient, we're using fewer flops, then make sure that's showing in your display, right? And then, you know, people can qualitatively say, okay, well, performance is about the same. It's not better, but wow, it uses a lot less, you know, energy or whatever it is, right? You know, oh, the performance is lower, but in this axis, I can see that it required so much less whatever. Or performance is lower, but on the axis of explainability, it was rated by humans much higher. I think if you pick your axes right, you can even show that you're the best according to the sort of plot of the axes. So I think it's, you know, it's important to pick the right way to display your results so you can see the trade-off that you're focusing on.
Right, because there are so many aspects. Also, I would like to remind you about the talk of Rada Mihalcha, which represented this with a Rubik cube with several faces, right? So you can see the same problem from one face or another, and maybe one of your faces is completely horrible and the other face is more ordered. So maybe you can try to publish in that sense. Well, there are advantages and disadvantages for most of the research we are doing. And also in this sense, Iman Jundi asks, well, what happens if you are realizing that your experiments are unsuccessful or you are stuck trying to do something work? Would you better give up, or how can you decide about this?
I think we just say something related to this. Steven say something interesting opinion. Something to ask for to answer this question and related to the last. I think from a researcher point of view, it would be good to write a paper with bad result or bad performance or about some method, but from a reviewer point of view, sometimes they publish, they don't select the paper to publish. So it's very hard to try to write a good paper with bad result or negative result, negative result. But maybe to answer the question, the last question, maybe it's good to try to analyze or describe good or well the negative result and try to deadline. But I recommend to just change or try to change something to go in another direction.
I'd also point out something that I replied to another question, which is that for negative results, there's actually a workshop now. I think it's in its second iteration called the Workshop on Insights from Negative Results in NLP. So, you know, if you tried something that seems like it makes a whole lot of sense, and you can argue for why it would make a whole lot of sense, but it actually doesn't work, and you think you have an interesting explanation for why it doesn't work, you should submit it to that workshop. So can every negative result get into that workshop? Obviously not. But if you think you actually learned something interesting from the failure, like, oh, Roberta totally should have solved this problem, and here's why it should be good at this problem, and it's actually not good, and look, I can show you why it's not good. That's a great negative result, and you probably can't get it into ACL because ACL, but you probably can get into the Negative Insights workshop. And I think that's worth doing as well, because those are cool things that we all want to learn about.
Thank you. And also in this line, Evgenia Tokarczuk says that thank you for this great discussion, and adds, even though not all the ideas work, as was discussed early, often a lot of effort and time has been put into it. And maybe it will be nice to see that someone else has already checked that in the past. So it's in the same idea that maybe we don't have to try again if somebody has already proved that this doesn't work in certain context, because sometimes we try to apply something in a different context and it may work. So well, we must be cautious before saying something won't work. And regarding the libraries, Christian Caballero suggests using Stanza, and Professor Christopher Manning says that it's great. And also there's Spacey. Well, this is well, in a chat. I'm not sure if you can say this. And what about controversial research topics? Because there are some things that are not, we are not sure, or maybe students are not sure about how sensitive are there. For example, Christian says, last year, one author had to retract a paper from ACL's conference because while analyzing how many female or male authors got published, he was accused of assuming the gender of the authors and invisibilizing non-binary authors. Maybe in his home country, that topic is not discussed as as in the English-speaking world. What do you think about this kind of issues?
Yeah, so that's a little bit complex. I mean, you know, overall, I think you shouldn't stay away, because I think often, you know, controversial research topics are often also exciting new research topics. And so you should be brave and engage. I mean, beyond that, it's complicated. You know, on the one hand, I think young people often much more have their fingers on the pulse of thinking approaches, what's all right to do and what's not all right to do. And, you know, it's much more likely that older people like me are out of touch. But, you know, the angle that was being mentioned is clearly right, that if you're sort of coming from different countries or talking about other cultures far away, it's easy for you not to have sufficient awareness of things that you might need to be aware of. So I guess you do want to be somewhat careful. You know, if you can, maybe this is a great opportunity if you can have some collaborator, whether as a co-author or someone who's willing to read the paper beforehand and give you advice and comments, that can really help avoid the worst of these problems.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And if you don't know where to look for someone to do that, I mean, I don't want to volunteer other people, but the recent, you know, conferences have often had like a diversity or inclusion head or an ethics group of reviewers. And even if they wouldn't individually be willing to send you feedback, they might be able to direct you to people who might. I mean, especially if you're in a really interesting area, but you're not even sure if what you're doing might be controversial or not. Reaching out to someone who's sort of done that as part of their job for a most recent conference, they might be able to help you. So for example, you know, NACL and ACL both have these kind of things: diversity and inclusion, ethics, etc.
Well, this is a whole issue, and maybe we could have a whole panel on this kind of discussions. But well, unfortunately, time is finishing. So I would like just to ask you for some final words of each one of you. Maybe we start with Professor Leticia. Would you like to add something, perhaps an advice, a comment, please, Professor Leti?
Okay, just say that I'm very happy to be here with all those people, wonderful people. And of course, I hope that my opinions or my advice can help all the students or all the people listening. And I am sure that I am learn a lot from each of one of you, and I'm very happy to be here. And just a final advice, just research, because it's wonderful. I like research. I like teach of obviously, but I wonder, for me, research is wonderful, and I like very much to research in NLP topics. So very much, thank you very much to all, and that's all for me.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Stefan would like to say something, closing remarks.
I'll just briefly say, I think we talked a lot about the many things that could go wrong in research, but I don't want to leave on that note. I think one of the strengths of having a huge research community is there's so many people to try so many different things. And as we've talked earlier, no one knows what's going to work or what isn't. And the more people we get involved in research, the greater chance we have of finding cool new things that we didn't realize would work. So if you have an idea, jump on it, try it. It might work, and we all learn something if it does.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you very much. And Christopher, would you like to say something, please?
Sure. So what I was thinking of saying is actually a bit related to what Stephen just said, but I'll give a slightly different angle on it. So an advice for grad students, Dave Patterson is a systems professor, likes to say the slogan, fortune favors the bold. And I think that's kind of right, that, you're not going to succeed in research by being too tentative, that you want to have some conviction that this approach is interesting. You'll be able to make some progress in getting it to work and sort of dive in fully, and that's your best chance of succeeding. And I think, that comes up in some of the other aspects of things that we've talked about in various places, like when we were talking about getting in contact with other people. Well, you can just send them an email, and you just have to take the attitude of, that person doesn't reply. Well, maybe they were busy, but that's just how it is. But here are two other people, I can write to them, and maybe one of them will reply. That, I think it's just good to sort of dive in and not be too afraid, and that will open opportunities and doors and directions for you. But otherwise, it's been great being on this panel, and I hope you've enjoyed it too.
Thank you very much. Well, yes, I was also very happy sharing with you. I think this is one of the events that makes us feel like a community, that we can discuss, we can talk, we can ask. We had a lot of questions from students and colleagues, and I think that made this mentoring session like very enriched. So thank you a lot to all of you. Thank you for being here. I hope next time you can physically come to Mexico, but virtually you are here and we are with you. We will remember this session very much. Thank you very much. Thank you for all the organizers as well. And time to say goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks.